And the furthest you can get away from the sea in Shetland is 3 miles. And you're generally within a mile or two of the sea. What the politicians seem to want, there's a very strong political agenda to build very large wind farms. And they see it as really something that's going to fill the energy gap. I think the politicians have got it wrong. We need renewables, but they need to be sensible. We need to be realistic about what they can actually produce us. Otherwise, I mean, they fall down on several counts. They're very heavily subsidised, and if you took the subsidy away, they would not be being built. We want to see renewables developed for Shetland, which are for Shetland, designed for Shetland. Now, there is a limit to the amount of variable renewables that you can put on a grid. That is the big problem with wind generation. It's variable. The wind isn't there one moment and it's there the next.
We're pro-renewable, like I think most people are. We want to see green power. We think that climate change is one of the biggest threats to wildlife and people. But there's got to be some very careful consideration into where they're actually located. You can't just put them in what is seen as an open area. You've got to be very careful where you actually locate them. You don't put them in the most sensitive areas for wildlife. You don't sacrifice your best places in the name of green energy.
This particular wind farm behind me, in that respect, really is just about the limit for what the Shetland grid can stand in that terms of variability, which flies in the face of the Scottish Government saying that they want 100% renewables, mostly from wind, by 2020, because technically that actually really can't happen. You must have backup. You must have conventional backup for when the wind doesn't blow.
The environmental legislation shows that it is one of the most pristine places. Such pristine places should be protected, and that there shouldn't be industrialised and covered in concrete and metal structures.
No, it's a fantasy in my view, a complete fantasy. It can't happen. We've had a huge disruption in Shetland since the 1970s with the arrival of the oil industry, but controls were put in place and the industry was regulated in a way that we've handled oil coming to Shetland and we've benefited from it. Viking Energy's development is huge. At the time it was first proposed, it would have been the largest onshore wind farm in Europe. In terms of actually siting something like a large wind farm in Shetland, it's really quite a problem because there's so much peat in Shetland. So we know what peat can do when you try to move it around in big volumes. We've seen that with when they built the Sustainable oil terminal and large volumes of peat had to be moved around and we had slips.
When you're putting a road on top of peat, it has an effect of usually drying out the peat and certainly can change the whole water table and the whole balance of the peat structure. You're then bringing in large volumes of concrete. To get this concrete you also have to bring in large vehicles, but you also need stone for concrete, so they'll be creating a huge number of borrow pits. I mean, some of these borrow pits are up to a kilometre square. They are huge, and borrows are rather a misnomer, they're basically quarries, so there'll be large numbers of them. When you're constructing on peat, you have to dig through the peat down to the base rock, in places that can be up to 16 feet deep, and you have to then do something with all the peat that you remove. So they're talking about backfilling the borrow pits with peat, which is just going to create huge slurry pits, for want of a better word, out on the moor.
And there's a rush at the moment for generating companies to get in on this subsidy before it disappears. Hence, a lot of the developments being proposed have really got very little to do with cutting greenhouse emissions and more to do with getting on the bandwagon and getting some of this generation subsidies while they can.
The reason why developers come here and construction companies come here is, at the end of the day, to make profit for their shareholders, but they will come across environmental designations because these areas are the most pristine areas of the UK. They think they can override these environmental laws, but as has been shown through the robust stance by the Scottish Government and also through groups such as the RSPB, that these actual laws will be upheld.
And that is really the problem here. We could be heading for an environmental, economic, production, energy security disaster, and the politicians are being very, very obstinate. They're not taking the good advice, the very sound, very practical advice from people who want to see a renewables industry that is realistic. There's the argument about the peat, because we don't feel it's a green project. It has to be proven to actually be carbon positive, if you like, carbon displacement positive. And there's an argument about the economics of it. And then finally this argument about whether wind generation can actually produce efficiently, and fill this huge energy gap.